Okay, turning to space and the environment, I'd like to introduce this session with just a few observations and ideas. If you recall what seems like a million years ago when my opening talk, the morning we opened the conference, one of the things I mentioned, and it's something I repeat frequently, is how absolutely vital it is all of us reach outside the space community, that we have a message that we can deliver to those who really don't get space for its own value, but yet find something that is important to these people and connect space to it. And certainly the environment falls into that category. I mean, there are just so many people in this country and around the world that the environment is so very important to them, the condition of it today, where it's going in the future. And one of the things I have found to be very helpful when I've had a conversation with someone who cares very deeply about the environment, one of the first questions I ask is, where does space begin? You know, most people don't think about that. And when pressed, they're really not sure. And there's various accepted definitions, but I've found that one of the most consistent and frequently used is that space begins at 100 kilometers altitude, or 62.5 miles, which is really not that far away. It's farther than a lot of people drive to work. I mean, it's easier to drive to work, unless you live in LA, but it makes the point that space is not this distant domain. And I like to emphasize that it really is just a continuation of our environment. And it's also exemplified, there's a book I want to mention, this just came out a few months ago, it's called Beyond Earth, The Future of Humans in Space, which of course is for sale out there. But this is a collection of essays that deals not just with space for its own sake, but all the other issues that are so important. So for this particular panel, I'm really thrilled to have with us Dr. Molly McCauley is a senior fellow at Resources for the Future, which is based in Washington, D.C. I first became aware of Dr. McCauley about a year and a half or so ago when I was doing some online research for an article I was writing, and was pleased to discover Resources for the Future and the work that Dr. McCauley has been doing for many years on the economic aspects of space solar power. Among other things, with all the work that she does, she's testified frequently to Congress, and I've read some of her testimony. So I've asked Dr. McCauley to talk about the economic aspects of space solar power. Prior to that, I've asked John Mankins of the Sunset Energy Council, who I think we all recognize as one of the foremost technical authorities on space solar power, and I've asked John to start out with a technical overview to bring us up to date on the current state of affairs. And John, of course, say whatever you might want to do as far as introduce the Sunset Energy Council. And I know Dr. McCauley is also going to talk a little bit about Resources for the Future. So at this point, I'd like to turn the mic over to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning. It is really bright up here. I'm going to take my chances with my coffee. Let's see how this works.
The enter button.
The arrow button?
Enter. And
Enter.
point it at the projector.
Got it. So the Sunset Energy Council, of which I am the president, was formed in 1978 by Dr. Peter Glaser, who invented the solar power satellite. I'll say words about that in a moment. It is the only non-governmental organization under the UN that is the purpose of which is to promote inexhaustible clean energy from space for the Earth. And the Council has had a series of past presidents, such as Brian Erb from the Canadian Space Agency and Greg Marinac, now or most with the X Prize Foundation. So a long tradition of advocates for the kinds of programs and new space enterprises that are reflected in this conference this week. Today, however, I would like to talk with you a little bit about the technical side of space solar power or solar power satellites. I'm working the enter button, but I'm not having that much luck with it. Oh, that worked fine. So I'll just say enter. Okay. So this is Dr. Peter Glaser. He doesn't travel much anymore. He's getting a little bit up in years, but he's still quite vigorous intellectually, and these diagrams are from the original patent that he received in the circa 1973 for his invention in the late 1960s of the idea of energy from space. And you see here several different manifestations of how that energy might be collected, processed, and then transmitted down to the Earth. Next, please. And one of the central, oh, too far. Another central figure who's unfortunately no longer with us is a gentleman by the name of Bill Brown of Raytheon, who holds many patents, held many patents in the field of wireless power transmission technology. Of course, many years ago, a gentleman by the name of Nikola Tesla had a vision of transmitting energy without wires. This was before the large-scale electrification of the U.S., but he had one difficulty, and that is that his notions were omnidirectional. There was no way to point the energy. This was all before the days of cavity magnetrons or the rectenna, the rectifying antenna, which was developed or invented by Bill Brown. So it's through predominantly the efforts of these two gentlemen, Bill Brown in establishing the key technologies to allow high-efficiency transmission, and Dr. Peter Glaser in inventing the idea of a platform that would collect energy up in a high Earth orbit, such as a geostationary Earth orbit, and then transmit that energy down to the ground. Next, please. However, and I'll say more about this in a few moments, the concept of SPS did not fare well in the 1970s for a variety of reasons, some technical and some political. One, however, who felt that SPS deserved to be revisited in the mid-1980s was the former NASA Administrator Tom Paine, who was the chair of the then National Commission on Space, who observed that the prospect of large-scale energy delivered to terrestrial markets could, if proven to be technically feasible, represent the ultimate new space enterprise. And it was very, very interesting. If you go back and look at the language which was used in the 1986 National Commission on Space report, you get a sense for how dangerous it was to talk about SPS at the time. And that's a consequence of what happened after the work in the late 1970s. Next, please. I put this in as a sort of a placeholder to remind you to say a few words in advance of what I'll talk about, I suspect, and that is that there is a tremendous and ongoing demand for new energy. This is the curve going back about 150 years from when almost everyone got their energy from wood or coal, basically the labor of their own hands or animals that they controlled themselves. Next, please. And that demand continues on into the foreseeable future, according to the U.S. Department of Energy Energy Information Agency. Next, please. However, there are dilemmas for many terrestrial renewable energy sources. This particular curve, the curve on the left, shows you past growth in ground solar power. The curves on the right show you the variation in a given location, how much sunlight is actually available. And so although the amount of solar energy in the economy that's derived from ground solar has been growing by leaps and bounds, nevertheless, there are fundamental limits because of the intermittent nature of the energy that comes from solar or other sources such as wind power. Unfortunately, there's an insufficiency of hydroelectric power, which is almost perfect in that you have large-scale power that can be put into the base load as you need it on the grid. The dilemma, it's okay, it's fine. The dilemma for space to become part of the energy solution, the nice thing about space is obviously the sun shines there virtually constantly in geostationary Earth orbit. The dilemma is that like any large-scale energy infrastructure, delivering energy into the grid from space is a very complex systems of systems problem. And this network of interrelationship starts in the upper left with the market demand and ends up in the lower right with the power cost, the energy cost. And in between, you have an array of interrelated factors, such as the frequency at which you beam the power, the efficiency, the limits on the energy density that you can reasonably beam it in order to assure that you've got a safe system, the size of the pieces that you want to launch, the launch system, and so on. Next, please. In trying to resolve that fundamental and complicated network of interrelationships, in the 1970s, there was this series of studies I mentioned a moment ago, and these systems concepts, in large measure, derived from that initial diagram, that cartoon, from the patent in the late 1960s, filed by Dr. Glaser. What you see is essentially a very large planar solar array in this painting on the upper right. In this particular case, it's a 10 gigawatt satellite. On either end of the solar array, you have two large 5 gigawatt delivered panels that are supported by some kind of electron tube array with the RF energy being fed through a planar set of waveguides. And those objects, those small disks above and below, are the waveguide structures. Is about 1 kilometer in diameter and has to be held flat across that 1 kilometer diameter to within a centimeter or two, i.e. a small fraction of a wavelength. In addition, to launch these kinds of systems, you had quite stupendous engineering requirements in terms of the fixed infrastructure. Quite stupendous and unique heavy lift launch vehicles, quite stupendous and unique in-space assembly and construction. Of course, solar power satellites were part of the genesis of the L5 Society and the whole idea of building very, very large space habitats for the thousands of workers to live in who would be working in deep space building solar power satellites in a way analogous to the way that large power plants are built today, i.e. they're stick-built. They're not prefab. Each power plant is a little different than all the others. The dilemma is that this kind of architecture, you end up with a pre-power cost, i.e. the amount of money that you have to spend before you deliver your first kilowatt hour of $300–400 billion, some stupendous amount of money. Also, there were a number of other technical problems with the systems concepts, but the biggest one was the cost to get to first power. Next, please. However, in the mid-1990s, NASA created an Office of Advanced Concepts and Technology. The Office of Advanced Concepts was one of the directorates in that. I worked for a gentleman there by the name of Ivan Becky, some of you may know. Ivan asked me to take a new look at solar power satellites. This became the Fresh Look Study. And we were tasked in the Fresh Look Study to see whether or not the technology advances of the past 20 years, from the 1975 timeframe to the mid-90s, would have made possible fundamentally new approaches to the problem of delivering energy from space. And the result of that study was yes, that we did believe that that was true. And the fundamental approach that we believe makes that possible is we characterize as intelligent modular systems. So this is these three photographs are depicting different scales of intelligent networks, so not semi-intelligent, it's either skydivers. And these folks are falling through free space. They've jumped out of their airplanes. They've had a few moments to configure into some prearranged pattern. And a great deal of what they have to learn to do is to only do what they're supposed to. And so they're limiting their intelligence. It doesn't take as much native intelligence to do this as you might think, and it's done all the time in the insect kingdom. And so what we arrived at is that you might, next please, you might use these kinds of large self-assembly arrays of systems to enable fundamentally new types of large space platforms and new types of solar power satellites. And this is all enabled by the dramatic advances in computing, in software development tools, in solid-state electronics, and so on. And so what we arrived at in the Fresh Look study were a series of systems concepts that were fundamentally different and did not require the tremendous and unique upfront infrastructure investment that the concepts did in the 1970s. Next, please. In 1980, the National Research Council basically said not only did they not like the results from the studies that were done by the Department of Energy and NASA in the late 1970s, but that no additional work should be done. In 2000, some 20 years later, we went back to the National Research Council and we presented them not a definitive economic case for SPS, but rather a technical roadmap saying, if this is a concept to be pursued, this is the way we would propose pursuing it. It was a stepwise, rapid prototyping kind of approach, and one which constantly fed out into space and space activities interim systems as stepping stones along the way. And that review went substantially better, with basically the basic finding that the technical roadmap was feasible, that the costs appeared reasonable through the first round of kinds of investments, and then they also had a series of constructive criticism. Unfortunately, after 2000, we had pretty much the same result as occurred in 1980. In other words, basically all work in the U.S. stopped within a year or two. Next, please. So in summary, a whole range of new concepts enabled by the same things that make possible, same kinds of technology advances that make possible cell phones and earplugs, wireless headsets, and all of those things, suggest that it is much more feasible now to talk about space solar power satellites than it was in the 1980 time frame. It's a whole set of primary markets for affordable and abundant energy in space that represent sort of stepping stones, both technically and from a market standpoint, to pursue very, very large-scale power in space with the potential to someday deliver it to Earth. There's a series of secondary system needs that have to be pursued in parallel that include transportation systems and in-space operational systems. But fundamentally, the results of the work of the last decade suggest that space solar power systems are, in fact, technically feasible, and the central question is are also economically feasible. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, and I'll just stand in for Jeff a bit to say that Howard Bloom has joined us, and we're delighted. Thank you.
Yes, after wandering through the corridors in vast and incomprehensible ways.
I think there's a strategy to that here with the...
Showing actually navigate.
No, the casino business.
Through the casino.
Yes, yes. Well, good morning. My name is Molly McCauley, as Jeff indicated, and I'm a senior fellow at Resources for the Future, which is in Washington, D.C. I also teach economics at Johns Hopkins University. And I've had the opportunity to work in the field of space economics for over 20 years. I came to it by accident. I happened to take a internship to earn some money for school at the Communications Satellite Corporation back when it was a quasi-government monopoly representing U.S. telecommunications interests for satellite-derived telecom. And I realized in the space world there were incredible engineers. At ComSat, there were incredibly talented lawyers working with the Federal Communications Commission to obtain geostationary orbital access, and with the FCC to frequency allocations, et cetera. But what seemed to be lacking was some of the economics that I was learning in school. So I proposed as a dissertation topic ascertaining the economic value of the geostationary orbit, and I had a dissertation advisor who said, sure, give it a try. And then when I was on the job market, this organization, which I had never heard of before, Resources for the Future, said, we've always thought of space in and of itself as a unique natural resource. Environment, other planets have their own environments. Would you like to come as a postdoc and think about space as a natural resource? And I thought I would give it a year, and I've been there, as I indicated, much, much longer than that. It's a delight to be here. This is my first time at this conference, but already this morning in the earlier session, I've discovered tremendous overlap with some of the research projects that I've been working on at RFF. One is a project that the Federal Aviation Administration has asked us to do at the request of Congress, having to do with the statutory role of that agency in third-party safety. This morning's discussion largely emphasized the safety of riders or participants, as we were told to call them, for new space vehicles. These would be private sector participants. The FAA also has a statutory requirement to protect third-party safety. So it's one thing for a participant to sign an informed consent and for the industry itself to seek to minimize risk to those paying customers. It's quite another thing to consider what would be the effect on public willingness to have this kind of activity if there were third-party risks that actually came to pass. So on behalf of the third-party studies, Congress has said to the FAA, think about how we need to play a role as a government regulator on behalf of the general public, regulated areas under overflight, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the things that this country has learned is we're still laboring under the effects of what I call the 3 Mile Island effect. As you know, as a result of the 3 Mile Island accident, our commercial nuclear power industry was stood down for a long time, even though it's supposed to be one of the safest forms of power and certainly one of the most environmentally benign. And finally, we understand there's some possibilities. There has been a new license recently issued by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and this industry may see a resurgence, but it has labored under, I think, an erroneous public perception of third-party safety issues associated with the generation of nuclear power, something we want to avoid if we can in our lines of business. We need the public to support us, to love us, but they have a different view sometimes if they have erroneous perceptions about third-party safety. And so anyway, I was asked to speak about satellite solar power, and my work at RFF in that regard has largely been encouraged by John and his colleagues who, on the technical side, have worked long and hard to figure out technological and engineering configurations that make economic sense. I come bearing from our research project some data. This is one of a number of different that this project has looked at. This project is funded by what I think is an important collaboration, the National Science Foundation, which typically sees no limits to the kinds of innovation that people have in science and technology in this country. It's funded by NASA, which has seen limitations, and it's funded importantly by the Electric Power Research Institute, which is a key private sector set of, well, an audience we need and possibly an audience that will come around to play a role here. So NSF, NASA, and EPRI have asked us to think about the economics of satellite solar power. And we are doing that through computer modeling that takes into account what will happen in the rest of the world, not only the US, and in other energy technologies, be it nuclear, be it fossil fuel, be it advanced combined cycle generation technologies, which are largely fired by natural gas but are fairly environmentally benign, and the host of renewable technologies, be they geothermal, solar thermal, hydro, biomass, wind. And SSP is large scale, as John has indicated. So it's not necessarily the case that we would anticipate it to be a US-only industry. It's probably much more likely to be international in scope. So we're looking at the economic viability of SSP with respect to competing energy technologies around the world, and in particular for purposes of making a couple of assumptions to try to get somewhere in an economic study, we're looking at SSP's potential economic import in the California-Nevada region, the Midwest region of the United States, chosen in part because California and Nevada has a lot of potentially very good solar technologies coming online in the coming decades, the Midwest because it's a key place for wind power. We're also looking in Germany. That country has led in European countries for its use of wind. It has, in the past 2 years, decided it's going to completely phase out nuclear. And then we're looking at India, because obviously it's one of the largest growing countries, terrific energy requirements, and a totally screwed up electricity system. It's fraught with corruption, power interruptions, power reliability is not something which an Indian consumer has access to at all. So Germany, India, and 2 regions in the United States, a host of other energy technologies, and we're asking questions such as, suppose SSP begins to come online in 2020 or beyond. What happens between now and then with respect to technological change in these competing energies, if you will? And what about the relative economic advantage of SSP in 2020 to 2030? Immediately, folks say, well, how do you have any idea? No one has a crystal ball with respect to innovation in those technologies, with respect to prices of fossil fuel, with respect to energy and national security, with respect to whether the public will ever care about so-called green power, which means that which is environmentally benign may not contribute greenhouse gases, and so on and so forth. And one is quite right, one doesn't know. But there are increasingly sophisticated but useful and usable software routines for incorporating uncertainties. So one of the features of our approach is we explicitly incorporate uncertainty using probability distributions, nothing fancier than that, for each of our key variables, parameterized by a lot of discussions with experts in the electric power industry and elsewhere, asking them what if, what if, what if. We're also informed by a host of research on the technological innovations in our conventional technologies and on folks who have attempted to quantify in economic terms the value placed on control of greenhouse gas emissions. We actually have real market data because carbon trading is now beginning to take place in market-like environments. So we know prices per ton of carbon. Fossil fuel use for power generation uses carbon-based technologies. So suppose we penalize those technologies in the coming days, assuming that carbon markets continue to develop. So you get the feel for how we're attempting to bring information to the model and generate these kinds of data and results. Our preliminary look, first of all, we try to stack the case for SSP. So we impose these kinds of carbon penalties on conventional technology in the coming 2 to 3 decades. Wind power itself is getting pushed back at by the environmental community because of a lot, as you probably read about, of issues associated with siting wind power. Folks think it's ugly. Folks think that it's noisy. Wind turbines take a lot of land acreage, and environmentalists and others are concerned about that. And of course, we've read about kills of birds and bats. The wind is usually in these migratory flyways, and that's where the birds are. So a number of issues are coming to the fore, precluding further wind development in much of this country. A lot of these concerns are also coming to the fore in Europe and elsewhere. So another way in which we try to stack the case for SSP in an initial run of the model is to use some of these estimates of the damages for the environment and also the extensive land acreage that a technology like wind uses. So for each of the competing technologies, we look at a host of environmental concerns. We also look at security. Advocates of SSP have long argued that an SSP technology is not subject to disruption in the Middle East. That may be. To what extent does energy security figure into our nation's and other countries' electricity power, as distinguished from the prices we pay for gasoline for our automobiles, keeping in mind that oil is largely a transportation fuel and electricity is largely coal and gas. And a lot of countries have their own indigenous coal supply, China, and especially the United States. So electricity generation is somewhat divorced from the Middle East, if you will. On the other hand, SSP itself, as I mentioned, is likely to be so large scale that it could be very international. We could have a consortium of commercial power companies around the world step up to fund, at least partially, perhaps fully, an SSP power generation system. The minute you do that, you will have energy security concerns, I suspect. Because if you come to rely on an in-space source of power, which is largely by way of an international consortium, you care a lot about not angering your partners because you don't want them to turn off the switch at the SSP source. So on the one hand, we have energy security concerns with our conventional power systems, but they're not necessarily likely to completely go away, depending on how SSP is eventually. And SSP itself may have some environmental impact. It's a source of generating the power. You still have to tap into an electric power grid in most cases, and so you use the traditional distribution and transmission lines to get the power to us at our places of work and business. So you're not completely invulnerable to power disruptions through terrorist or other kinds of activities, because unless it's coming to your rooftop, which it could be, but it's likely at least first to come to large ground-based receiving stations and then transmit through the regular grids that are in place in most scenarios that I've seen. So you still have some issues along the way in actually getting it to us. What do our numbers show? We show that if SSP could come online in present dollar terms 2020, 2030 for 11 to 14 cents per kilowatt hour for the generation of the. So you're saying, well, my electric bill shows I'm paying so much per kilowatt hour. Keep in mind your electric bill is generation, distribution, and transmission. So if it's broken down on your bill by the generation, transmission, and distribution, you can look at what you're presently paying for generation, and you can sort of get a feel for 14 cents per kilowatt hour for the generation side in about 2020, 2030. And it could be competitive in some of these areas of the world, given population growth, energy demand, and so forth. It's also cautionary to note that when consumers flip a switch, they want reliability. We want reliability. And by and large, to date, we collectively speaking, most folks have not cared whether it's coming from a coal-fired plant or wind. We just want that reliability. That's what we're largely willing to pay for. That may change over time as public communities become more sensitive to environmental concerns, or government access to, by way of taxing, as I mentioned, through carbon taxes and others, these external effects. So we may have to pay through the pocketbook for cleaner power, or we may decide as a community we care about it and are willing to pay for it. But by and large, I contend the fundamental driver is flip the switch, make sure the lights come on. So that's the basis upon which we're finding we think SSP will need to compete. So is it going to be a reliable source of power? Its environmental and security benefits may or may not figure as prominently as we might think they will. So our additional model runs ask a lot of what-if questions like this. But I think the perspective, the bottom line is, opportunities for SSP look more favorable now than I think they did several decades ago for all of these reasons. But these competing energy technologies, they're innovating as well. And some of the wind power conferences which I've attended, and biomass in particular for countries like India, incredibly fantastic innovation and technological change, getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So we have to look over our shoulders, as any new energy does, as we look at the competition with which we'll have to deal. So thanks.
Well, I'm wearing 2 microphones here, so I wonder if they're counting on me having 2 larynxes. I find myself in a very unusual position because, because I came to this table today to talk about our attitudes toward nature and how everything you know from Al Gore's latest film, which seems to have galvanized everybody that I know, is wrong, and everything that it implies about solutions is wrong as well. But by accident, I find myself sitting between Molly and John, who have been working on space solar power. So I'll tell you a tiny little story about what really brought me to spend the money to send myself out here at my own expense. For the last 2 years, Paul Werbos at NSF, who has probably funded some of your work and some of your work, Paul Werbos has been mentoring me. And I've been mentoring him. And in the mentoring process, Paul has been trying to convince me that ethanol and methanol are 2 viable forms of fuel for automobiles. And I have thought this was a ridiculous notion. Then Paul got on the case. You know that he funded the artificial or the intelligences that would allow all of your arrays to hook up together into a giant array. And he's also funded many other technologies that relate to space solar power. Now, for 2 years when he talked about space solar power, again, I was totally skeptical. And then Feng Shu, who's sitting in the audience and is a senior risk analyst for NASA and has been a risk analyst on the Space Shuttle program, the ISS, the International Space Station, and now on the Constellation program, looked at space solar power and said, this is the answer for our problems for the future. Now, I am a person who's accustomed to basically being Moses leading his chosen people into the promised land. I'm always looking for a new promised land into which to lead people, because if you can't find a new promised land, people's brains are going to go dead, their creativity is going to go dead, their economy is going to go dead, and the culture of which they're a part is going to become one of the great lost civilizations of history. Over the course of the last 4 months or so, working with Feng, working with Paul, working with members of the Aerospace Technologies and Working Group, I've come up with a simple plan. And the simple plan is, let's concentrate our energies for the next 15 years on the development of biofuels. There are already 5 million biocapable cars on the roadways in the United States. There are major automakers in the United States who are already producing 36 different models of cars that are biofuel capable. And when I say biofuel capable, I mean they use the technology that was invented in Brazil, so that if you stop at a gasoline station in Brazil and fill your tank with gasoline, a small detector in your system determines exactly what you've got in your tank and adjusts your engine accordingly. If the next time, 220 miles down the road, you need to fill your tank again, and what you come across is a biofuel, an ethanol station, once again, that sensor determines what mix of fuels you've got in your tank and totally adjusts your engine. So you can run on biofuels or gasoline. And the result is that in Brazil, approximately, and you can correct me on this figure because it's changing all the time, but 40 to 60% of the automobiles right now are running on biofuels. And the big burst forward in biofuels has come with the invention in the last 3 years of the flex fuel vehicle, the vehicle with the little sensor that tells the engine exactly how it should adjust itself. So in trying to look at a civilization, ours, which doesn't seem to see a future for itself and feels that it deserves to die because it is the absolute paragon of plundering of the planet. All it's doing is throwing massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. It's going to kill off every form of life that we know. Bambi's going to be dead. And for our sins, and of course we've been the greatest imperial of the world, which is not true at all, but this is what most of my friends believe. As a consequence, it's time for us to decline and fall. Another thing they've been heavily influenced by is a small accident, and that is that in 1776, 3 major documents came out in the English language that have shaped the way that we think. And one of them is the Declaration of Independence, one of them is The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith that founded economics, and one of them is a book by a guy absolutely fascinated with Rome, spent 20 years studying the Roman Empire, and chose the wrong name for his book. Instead of calling it The Astonishing Rise of the Roman Empire and How It Stayed on Top of Things for Approximately 1,200 Years, which would have been a somewhat awkward title, he chose a catchier one, and it was The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which has given us the impression that empires decline and fall. We've been an empire. We've been the grandest empire in history. Hence, it is now our turn to decline and fall. I'm sorry, none of that is true. First of all, the Roman Empire did last from approximately 400 BC until approximately 500 AD, a nice 900 years, not bad. But other empires have lasted far longer. The Chinese Empire has gone through its ups and downs and has recovered from every single down to a new up, and has done that for a minimum of 2,200 years, and the Chinese calculated is closer to 5,000 years. The Egyptian Empire stayed on top of things also for between 3,000 and 5,000 years. Empires do not necessarily decline, they simply lose their sense of horizons. So what we've come up with is a horizon plan, a plan to give America a new frontier. Step 1 being biofuels, so that we can get rid of our dependence on foreign oil. And people in the United States are really, really, really sick of buying foreign oil at this point. Second, space solar power. Why space solar power? Because people need to look up, people need to see the sun, people need to see something shining, people need to see endless frontiers of energy. And there is an endless frontier of energy out there in space. The third part of this program is the mining of materials on the moon and the asteroids in order to build the space solar power systems. There's no sense in having to lug stuff at $4,000 a pound from the Earth into space when there are tons of materials in space that can be processed in space. And then you space economy. And step 4 is the moon, which is Robert Zubrin's vision, which is a vision that he got across so brilliantly that's absolutely captivated me for the last dozen years. Why do we want to present this to America as a unified plan? Again, to give us new frontiers, to hook our imaginations into and begin to dream again, instead of having mere nightmares and beginning to pick ourselves apart. This is not what I came to talk to you about. I came to talk to you about the fact that the ideas of Mother Nature in films like Al Gore's film, remember, I'm a registered Democrat. I am not a right-wing opponent of Al Gore, not by any stretch of the imagination. I voted for him. But the fact is that there is this assumption in my community, that is the community on the left, that Mother Nature is wonderful and nice. And the vision of the Garden of Eden has never gone away. So we imagine that if we simply get rid of all of the horrors that we are doing to pollute the atmosphere, that suddenly Mother Nature will turn green and nice and will take care of us like a loving mother. And I'm sorry, this is not Mother Nature. This is not what Mother Nature has ever done with life. Mother Nature has thrown in the last 2 billion years at least 80 ice ages at her creatures. She has thrown 146 mass extinctions at her creatures. This planet gathers 300 million kilos of space dust every single year. But we're on a 66 million mile orb, or 66, I get all my zeros mixed up, so bear with me here. But we're on a 66 million year cycling around the galaxy. And as we twist around the galaxy, we go through all kinds of strange galactic weather. And as we go through that galactic weather, some of which is called galactic fluff, the amount of space dust in our atmosphere can triple. Imagine the impact on the environment, the impact on our weather. It's tremendous. We have been fortunate enough to live in a period of 10,000 years to 12,000 years in which we've had climatic stability. Well, I'm sorry, that isn't nature. This has been the most unnatural period climatically, probably in the history of the Earth. And we're accustomed to the idea that if we simply cut down on the carbons that we throw into the atmosphere, that nature is going to suddenly turn back and stay a nice, wonderful forest with lots of greenery. It's just not true. There have been periods of time where there have been 20 times to 200 times the amount of carbon dioxide that there is in the air today. So what is the message of all of this? Nature throws enormous change our way. Nature has been trying a new experiment for 3.85 billion years now. It's the cell and DNA partnership. The cell and DNA partnership is responsible for all of life. Something like 40 to 60% of the genes that are involved in yeast, that are involved in bacteria, are also involved in Molly, John, and me, and all of you. They're called highly conserved genes. Now, why in the world would 40% of the genes be varying wildly? Because basically what life has been trying to do is find its way into as many nooks and crannies as it possibly can before the next great annihilation comes, before the next great die-off comes, before the next great cosmic catastrophe comes, because there always are cosmic catastrophes. This planet runs them nonstop. One of the things that most of the successful organisms on this planet have discovered is that every form of toxic pollutant is an energy source or a building material waiting to be reperceived, waiting to be rediscovered. For example, cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria manage to take advantage of light. Taking advantage of light to make cells, it's one of the most ridiculous ideas I've ever heard. If you had to run it through the kinds of programs that you're running here, you would conclude that it's absolutely impossible, and we'd never even try it. We'd never try it in a million years. The fact is, Mother Nature perfected it very, very early after the development of cells. In fact, it was one of the first things she perfected. I've told this story before at this conference, but bear with me. These unicellular organisms that live in huge, well-organized communities, the cyanobacteria, are sitting there processing solar energy and water and turning it into life stuff, biomass. Unfortunately, like us, they have to excrete the stuff that they can't digest. Now, one tiny microscopic bacteria farting what it cannot possibly get rid of or can't possibly use into the atmosphere means nothing. The atmosphere seems absolutely endless. But when you get a colony of 7 trillion of these things and they're the atmosphere, it still doesn't make any difference. And if you get trillions of colonies farting into the atmosphere, it still doesn't make any difference. But if they fart long enough, eventually they will and did pollute the atmosphere, and they polluted it with a deadly, deadly poison. This was toxic pollution to the nth degree. It created one of the first really major mass die-offs because most of the unicellular creatures around at that time could not process this stuff. Not only couldn't they process it, it killed them off immediately. According to Lynn Margulis, who to my mind is one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century, a strange thing happened. Some cells got together with other cells and basically invited them into their system. Some cells that could not process oxygen, that would be poisoned by oxygen, invited into their system other cells that could process oxygen. And those became the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are sitting inside processing oxygen at this moment. Oxygen is the toxic pollutant that was responsible for one of the first mass die-offs in the history of this planet. What does this tell us? It says that the carbon we're pouring into the atmosphere is a resource we haven't learned to use yet. And running scared from it all the time isn't going to help us. One reason that running scared from it all the time isn't going to help us at all is, again, Mother Nature has put up to 200 times as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at various times for various random reasons as we're putting up today. So simply stopping our industrial pollution is not going to stop a thing when it comes to weather change. What does this have to do with space solar power? What does it have to do with Mars? What does it have to do with the moon? 60% of the population of humans on this planet live in coastal areas. One of the things we began to learn 300 years ago when we started to learn about geology and gradually put a picture of evolution is that every location that right now is a coastal area will eventually be deep beneath the sea, mired in a swamp, or at the top of a mountain. Which means New York City, the city that I live in, is eventually not going to be able to exist as a stable city sitting in one place. This means if we're going to survive as humans, we cannot count on weather circumstances being sufficiently stable that the Midwest will always be the grain belt, for example. We can't count on the Great Grain Belt to be grain belts either. All of those will be deserts eventually, or they will be swamps. So what do we have to do? As strange and science fictionist as this sounds, we are going to have to make floating cities. And we're going to have to make floating agriculture. Now, who in the world had a dream about 20 years ago of floating cities and floating agricultures? It was a guy named Gerard O'Neill. And Gerard O'Neill is the guy who inspired most of the people who put together this conference today. Now, Gerard O'Neill's visions of floating cities out in space and of floating agricultural systems out in space can be applied to the Earth as well. And if we think that the very idea of putting New York City with its population of 20 million on floating vessels is impossible, you're absolutely right. It's almost impossible. It's going to be very, very hard to do. But the fact is that there is a floating town of 50,000 people, roughly, I think it is. It's out there in the middle of the ocean right now. Lonnie Shore, who's a part of the Aerospace Technology Working Group, has done the architecture. They've sold condominiums in this ship. So you buy yourself an apartment in a floating ship that goes from one city to another, and you've already got the beginning of floating vessels. Plus, we've been building oil platforms for a long time, and we know these oil platforms are in some of the most horrible places in the world when it comes to their meteorology, when it comes to their weather. And these things have been designed to only fit 350 people at most, but they've been designed to weather every kind of storm that can possibly be thrown their way. So we have the beginnings of floating architectures for floating cities and for floating hydroponic gardening under our fingers right now. The reason that we wouldn't sign the Kyoto Treaty was because it would cost a fortune. It would cost a fortune. It wouldn't stop China. It wouldn't stop India. And look how far China and India have gone in the 15 years since the treaty was first proposed. They've gone a long way. If we had been walking around with shackles on, which we would have if we'd signed the Kyoto Treaty, we would be in sorry condition today. The fact is, if we're going to put a huge investment of the kind that we're putting into all of these environmental concerns, first we're wrong. The environment is going to change one way or the other. Our job as part of biomass is to find the latest nooks and crannies in which biomass can be safe from change. We want to find it in the light. Right now, bacteria, look, if we all die, if the whole multicellular experiment goes down the drain because we put our money in the wrong place, trying to stop our smokestack effusions, Mother Nature's not going to stop, and biomass as an experiment is not going to stop, because unicellular creatures called bacteria are just as clever at research and development as we are, and far less inhibited. They don't come up with these catastrophic scenarios. They work their way to the next resource. And 2 miles beneath our feet at this very moment, we have lithotrophs, lithoautotrophs, that is bacteria that are eating granite and processing it into biomass. Now, when the next great catastrophe comes, even if it's one of those catastrophes that comes from our 65 million year circuit around the center of the galaxy, those things are going to survive. If they're so smart, why are we so dumb? To me, space solar power is something right now that can grab the imagination of the public because it wants to be free. It wants to be free of the energy constraints that are laid upon it by being dependent on foreign oil. It wants to know that there is a beacon in the sky. This is something humans dream about, beacons in the sky, and right now we're not going to go into the questions in evolutionary biology about why we have these dreams, because we could discuss them for hours. But the fact is, we do dream of beacons in the sky. And beacons in the sky await us, and they wait us to make them. And space solar power is an excuse for getting Gerard O'Neill's colonies up into space. The moon is an excuse, populating the moon is an excuse too, because that's where we can get the raw materials to produce all of this solar power. And that's where we can build the vessels that will take us to Mars. I mean, why build a vessel on Earth to take us to Mars when it's so goddamn expensive, and when you've got all the raw materials on Mars vessels, and taking them from lunar orbit, building them in lunar orbit and taking them from lunar orbit to Mars costs almost nothing. I mean, you could do it with the equivalent of candles on one end, and I said this several days ago, but you could build a vessel the size of this hotel or larger, and you could take it all the way to Mars on very little power at all. Put out a couple of solar sails, put up a couple of ion propulsion drives, put 300 of them up. And if 100 of them fail, you've still got 200 to make it all the way to Mars. So, and when it comes to space solar power, what I've been advocating recently, and the two of you can tell me if it's at all practical, we don't want Big Brother providing us with our energy source. And India doesn't want the Department of Defense in the United States deciding to turn off its power because it's done something that we don't agree with. Well, what about processing? That is, what about putting up, having Minneapolis, one corner of Minneapolis putting up its own space solar sat and getting its energy from there? What about, instead of the current distribution grids we're using, simply putting the equivalent of one of those little dishes that we've got to get our TV reception up on people's roofs and allowing them to get this stuff directly so that they don't have to do it indirectly? What about massively parallel processing as much as possible with as many different kinds of communities, whether it's the fans of the Buffalo Bills, or it's the International Yahoo Society, putting up their own systems so that, just like with the internet, we have a very, very robust system. Yes, it can be crashed, but the fact is that the more parallel distributed we make it, the less subject to crash it is. So is this a practical idea? Molly, is this a practical idea, using parallel distributed processes?
Well, sure it is. But remember that if you have a dish on your roof, so you're totally independent of the Department of Energy.
Right.
You're a householder in Montana, and you're as libertarian as they come. You still need a way to store the energy overnight and in the winter.
Right.
And energy storage is really expensive in that capacity.
Okay.
But I'm not saying innovation can't change. I'm just saying, when I hear your vision, I get excited, but I've been inherently pragmatic about it.
Right.
So I want to think about all the ifs, and because I guarantee you, you walk out there and you start discussing this with the public, they get very interested, but they're damn practical. So they're going to want answers to these questions, and we just need to think about them.
Okay, and I think we need to think about them too, and we do need to have answers. Paul Werbos just got back from China 2 months ago, and Paul was wildly excited. Why? Because of the battery technology that he saw in development there.
We need a lot of things to
Right, exactly. Plus, there's the old storage system of simply pumping water up during the day and then letting gravity descend at night.
Which takes energy too.
Right, right.
Okay.
So there are a lot of these potential things. John, what do you think of the practicality of parallel distributed solar, space solar power?
In terms of the in terms of the idea of distributing it to localities,
Right,
I think it's perfectly practical.
right,
In terms of say everyone has a dish that they use to collect
Right.
their energy, the dilemma is that it's very difficult to beam the energy with that kind of precision. It's
Right.
virtually impossible. The only practical solution. the only practical. I understand you want to record me, but I'd also like to be able to think clearly. The only practical solution, if you wanted that,
yeah,
would be really large optics with lasers.
right. And that's being developed.
I understand that, but
It's not necessarily the safest, but it's being developed.
I understand, but a lot of households you use 2-3 kilowatts steady.
Right,
That's really high energy density.
right.
It's not clear that that would be a desirable system to develop with the ability to target individual homes.
Well, I have another question.
But the localities,
Yeah.
You basically the line of thought that we've taken with this, and right or wrong, is people would be more comfortable with beamed energy if it is a relatively small fraction of the energy that's in sunlight.
Right,
That if you doubled that kind of intensity, you've got a problem. And so it's a problem to beam energy to individual homes.
Right.
Individual cities? No
okay, well,
problem.
individual cities is fine by me as a start.
Okay.
I have another question. John and I have not met until the last 2 days, and we still haven't a chance to talk except right here behind this table. I would probably never have met if we were sitting by accident at a table where I thought we were talking about nature. I would like to suggest a conference of the people who are interested in the four-step program that I've just laid out. That includes Robert Zubrin for the Mars element. It includes the members of the Space Frontier Foundation for the mining of the moon and putting up permanent residencies in space. And it includes John. It includes all the other organizations. There's another space organization that's meeting in Spain in September and is going to start Sunsat. We need to get all of the people who are operating as part of this program together, including people like the folks at General Motors who have spent tens of millions of dollars advertising their flex fuel vehicles, and not a single person I've ever talked to has a clue that flex fuel vehicles is what they were advertising. This was their Go Green, Be Yellow program, which I don't know if you've seen the ads, but they were all over the Super Bowl and they were all over the Olympics. And nobody that I know has any idea that Go Green means be environmentally friendly, use biofuels, and Go Gold means let's get our source from corn, which is a ridiculous idea because there's so much more waste material that we can actually utilize for this stuff, including all of the stuff that you and I go and dump in the bathroom when we periodically have to go through these things. We hide from each other, getting rid of our poisons the way bacteria farted out theirs. Well, all this stuff is raw material for energy. So the question is, who would anybody suggest, and I'm taking questions from the audience, I know we have to quit.
Which means, unfortunately, I can't take questions from the audience, but I have a better idea.
Okay.
First of all, I want to thank all three of you, Molly, John, and I just went blank. on
It's
your
Harold.
name.
Yes, the literary
Sorry.
critic. Howard.
Thank you for being on the panel. I love the way you concluded your talk because that's exactly why I wanted to have this panel, is to broaden the conversation outside the space community, and your call to bring people together to a conference, an event to do that is exactly what needs to happen. What I'd like to suggest is we have ice cream and other nice treats outside, so we'll take a 10-minute break, continue the conversation out there,
Right.
and then we can prepare for the next panel.
Okay,
I
the
know
next
we
one
can-
is sex in space?
That's
Yeah,
right.
okay, so none of us want to miss that.
You know, as great as sex is, we're talking ice cream here.
Yeah, and I understand that Rick is going to demonstrate sex in space for us.
All right, maybe you don't want to eat too much ice cream then. I apologize for having to cut you off.
Oh, that's
You
okay.
of all people.